Gotham Investigations. I'm Jeff Giordano. These are true crime investigations. Justice for Menacol. What happens when the feds have their sights on you and they are looking at taking you down with possible life imprisonment? What can Jesse expect behind the scenes from his defense team? What can he expect offers that may be made to him in the near future? We're going to have a prominent attorney on our show that works a lot of defense cases and goes against the federal government. You're going to get those answers. Stay tuned. Welcome to Gotham Investigations. I'm your host, Jeff Giordano. This season of the Jesse Menocal case, this is an active case where the feds are pursuing not only civil rights violations, but sexual allegations against this decorative police sergeant. We have a special guest on our show today, and his name is Francisco Marty. Francisco is not only a criminal defense attorney, he is a prominent attorney that works in the federal court system defending clients, as well as a death penalty attorney, a qualified death penalty attorney. Francisco, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and good afternoon, everybody. I like your hat.
Thank you. Thank you. It's part of our investigative techniques to remain undercover.
There you go. I'm sure it works.
Absolutely. So, Francisco, before we get started, if anyone wanted to contact you for their services, do you have a website they could look up? How would they find you?
I guess Francisco Marty, attorney, Miami. I forgot the exact address of our website. My office is located at 6790 Coraway and 305-545-5282. I've been there 18 years, and you're welcome to call me.
So the reason we couldn't have the attorneys that are working the case on the show is there's attorney-client privilege, of course, and they cannot talk about the case. So we're not going to really be talking about the case in particular, but some of the specifics that went into it. All of the information is public record. It's already out there, and we're just bringing it to you. So first I'm going to read Francisco the closeout memo. This is a closeout memo from the state attorney's office, that the state attorney's office didn't feel that there was enough information and evidence to move forward with any prosecution at all against Sergeant Menocal. They referred it back to the Hialeah Police Department for administrative purposes only. So let me read you what the closeout memo says here. 3 young girls, teenagers, all friends, members of the 24th Avenue gang, came forward and each claimed that the subject was known to them because he was a sergeant that patrolled the area that they lived in. They made almost identical allegations that he, on separate occasions, picked them up in his police vehicle and asked them for oral sex. Some said they complied. One girl said the subject asked her for sex, but that she told him she had her period and he let her go. None claimed outright force or threat, just authoritative pressure from the sergeant. None of them reported any of the allegations prior to seeing the subject on the news. They came forward after speaking with Special Victims Detective Rosalind Bird. Sergeant Bird has since retired out of state. None of the girls could move than a vague date range for the incidents that happened. They could not give any more information than that. One girl, a bipolar chronic runaway, said that she threw her clothes in a lake immediately after the incident. She claimed that she weighted the clothes with a rock. Divers were sent into the lake and no clothing was recovered. DNA was taken from each of the girls' clothing and his vehicle as well. None of those samples matched any DNA from the subject's police car or office. None of the cell phones belonged to the girls could be linked to the sergeant. No witnesses to any of the allegations. During the course of the investigation, one of the girls died, unfortunately. She jumped out of a moving car during an argument with her boyfriend. Based on the lack of corroborating evidence, the criminal investigation cannot proceed. The matter would be handled administratively by the Hialeah Police Department. So the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office has probably some of the most seasonal detectives throughout the United States that conducted this investigation, and they could not find any corroborating evidence to proceed. So why would the federal government, when they have their targets on you, it's kind of like being a deer in headlights, why would they persist and go after him so aggressively to arrest him and move forward with charges?
Go ahead. Well, let me start by this. The two jurisdictions, we got the state of Florida versus U.S. Attorney's Office, the way they make a probable cause decision is different. Miami-Dade County Police or City of Miami Police or whatever police, local police department you have, along with the state attorney's office, they make a probable cause decision without putting it in front of a grand jury. That's important to understand, and it's not that unusual that there is a local police department investigation that where the entities determine that there's no probable cause, and then the feds pick it up. It happens. I say it happens quite often. Now, what is the different way in which they operate? In this case, what was the department that investigated them? I'm sorry?
The Hialeah Police
The Hialeah
Department,
Police Department.
but it was also taken away from them, and it was investigated by the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office.
Correct.
That had the final findings on the case.
Okay. So they may very well feel like Memo explains that they don't have probable cause. Why do the feds pick up certain cases and they don't pick up others? That happens in different ways. Sometimes Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office or Miami-Dade Police Department contacts the feds and says, look, we're a little lacking. We're out of resources. We're not going to continue the investigation. It's just a strategy decision. Do you guys want to pick it up? The state could say, no, I don't want to continue. I don't have enough probable cause. Or I think I can get to probable cause, but we need to spend more resources. And a police officer, like I said before, is always an attractive target to the federal government. Where perhaps that same case with you or I or somebody that's not in service may not be picked up by the feds. So I think what happened there, he's a police officer. It's a case that involved multiple victims, and it's a case that the feds found an interest in, and it's just easier for them to indict. They do a more thorough investigation. They present it to a grand jury, which I'm sure they did, and a grand jury indicts. I don't know if it came out prior when we did the first part, but there's a saying within the legal community that in the U.S. District Attorney's Office, you can indict a potato. And that is because a lot of people don't understand the process. The federal investigators do the investigation. They hand it to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They present it to a grand jury, which is individuals that are our peers. And the defense is not there. It's a secret proceeding. So all they have to do is convince that grand jury that there's probable cause to believe that a crime was committed. And they always get an indictment, almost always, and that's what happened there.
So why won't they do this from the beginning? Is it common that they would wait till the prosecution from the state would finish their findings?
I've seen it before. It's hard when you use the word common. Is it common? I've seen it many times before. It happens in drug cases. I've seen it in methamphetamine cases where the state even makes the arrest, not only investigates, makes the arrest, decides not to prosecute, and a week later the feds pick it up. The exact reason of why, I don't think anybody knows the reason. I think is whether it rises to the attention that a specific prosecutor wants it, but it happens. This is not something specific to this case. It happens. I think it's more common, or it's more attractive to the feds when you have a politician, a police officer, or even an attorney sometimes.
So in this particular case that we're actively working here, the victims themselves, members of this gang, the first one that came forward, she ended up dying, jumping out of a moving vehicle. But the other ones are all members of the gang, and they didn't come forward until they saw him on TV, on television. So this kind of prompted them. One of them was Baker acted several times for even scratching herself and attempting to kill herself. The other one, as the closeout memo said, was just a chronic Baker act herself. So these victims have like no teeth behind it. Do you think he's actually looking at life in prison if he's found guilty? Do you think there's going to come a time where the feds may offer a deal to him?
Absolutely. Once the case is in the federal government, on that jurisdiction, it's two different jurisdictions. In the state, I want to say you have more hallway negotiations. In the feds, you have negotiations. There's a limit to what you can negotiate and what you cannot, because you have the U.S. sentencing guidelines that sort of guide. You can't go too much off the guidelines, but I think it's going to be negotiated at one point. I think that the charges are exposed to too much sentencing. Whenever you're exposed to too much sentencing, the risk of not negotiating becomes higher. And what does that mean? Well, if you have charges where you're exposed, and just to say a number, in no cases talk about this case, but if you have a specific charge where your sentencing exposure is 5 years, and you're negotiating 1 or 2 years, and you don't like the negotiations, your risk of going to trial is less. In a case like his, and I'm not sure what his sentencing exposure is right now in the feds, but I'm sure it's very high.
He could be looking at life in prison if
He
he's
could
found
be
guilty
looking-
on one of these
These are
gross
life.
allegations.
These are life charges. So whenever you get life charges, the probability of negotiating the case is high, because the risk is life. So if you were to ask me now, my short answer, this case is most definitely going to be negotiated. My next answer is this a case that's going to be, if that were your question, going to end up with zero sentencing as far as prison time, or is this something that's going to be negotiated with sentencing? I believe that it's going to be negotiated. I believe that the sentence is not going to be anywhere double digits, but I do believe that he's going to have to serve some federal time, and that's just shooting from the hip.
So if he were to plead out to this, or he was found guilty, could they always bring in additional charges later on if he was in jail?
Technically, they can, if the additional charges were not encompassed in whatever he was charged with now. Sometimes the negotiation includes cooperation, which means you come in, you cooperate with the feds, you practically accept the responsibility, and you say everything that you were involved in. When that happens, the chances of being hit with something else later are minimized, because you came in and you volunteered information. But can he be charged with something else later on if he's brought in to talk with investigators and he forgets to mention something, and 1 year from now a new victim arises? It could happen. I think the feds stay away from that. I've been doing this for a while, and I think the feds stay away from prosecuting, indicting, and then coming back with something new, unless it's totally different charge.
Well, the fear would be not from the same victims, but other victims, like the first time when they saw him on television, that they see this and they take an opportunity that I can also come in with allegations, but file a separate civil suit, which some of them already have.
It could happen. I'm not going to say it can happen. I don't think it's likely. If he gets, let's say, for the purpose of this program, if he cooperates, he negotiates, he pleads guilty, he's sentenced, and 2 years from now a new victim comes out, that's not the normal case where you get them re-indicting you. It could happen from a legal standpoint.
So I'm a common citizen out there. I work, whatever, in a medical clinic facility, Medicare fraud, and I'm just a secretary, and the feds come knocking on my door to ask questions. What should I do? Should I cooperate, answer questions? What should I do?
All right. The first answer, and I think it's the correct answer, if you're not being represented, and that's usually how it happens, they knock on your door, and you went to clinics now, which is my world, healthcare. The answer is usually do not speak to federal agents. What happens is that most of us think, well, if I didn't do nothing, I have nothing to hide. But it's more complicated than that. When they knock on your door, they knock on the door because there's something that brought them there. And sometimes your answers are totally unrelated to the charge, but they incriminate you. So the answer is no. Don't talk to investigators. It may very well be that you go get an attorney, you explain the case to the attorney brings you in himself. That's fine, because that's a negotiated cooperation interview. But the answer is no. You know, when the feds knock on your door, the best answer is a courteous. I do my own YouTube sometimes, and I call it the 3 C's. calm, collected, and courteous. A calm, collected, and courteous, no, I can't speak to you. That's what I think the answer should be.
Now, we've done, a lot of cases and stuff together.
That's
How
right.
important is a private investigation, individual investigator for a defense team?
In serious cases, and you know best, I've used you as an investigator. I can't imagine, and I'm a death penalty attorney, you said it, these are homicide cases, and I do serious crimes. I cannot imagine complex, serious crimes without a defense attorney using an investigator. You have to understand the state attorney's office or the U.S. attorney's office uses investigators. That's how they investigate the case. You come to the case after the investigation is done. To sit down as an attorney or paralegals or whatever your staff may be, and however large your firm may be as an attorney, to sit down with your staff and review discovery of the investigation that the prosecution did, you're always going to fall short. Yeah, I think the investigation by a private investigator, a qualified private investigator like you are, or any other, there's many out there. It's not only you, Jeffrey, but many out there. It's very important. It's how you get that second look at the case. When you're looking at discovery, you're looking at their case. When I get you as an investigator, I'm looking at my case, my defense, my case. So I think it's very important.
Now, I'm sure you represented a lot of people that, I've seen it throughout my police career, that they're scapegoats. They really are on the scene at a bad time, and the feds, as well as the state prosecutors, they pick this one individual out of the group, and they say, we're going to get him to talk, and we're going to stick it up his ass, sort of say, even though he really wasn't the primary individual, to see if we can get him to talk.
Everybody's seen it. You've seen it. I've seen it. The least culpable defendant in a case is usually the most vulnerable to speak, because the least, if let's say we have a real active criminal scheme where a group of people are clearly committing crimes knowingly, it usually doesn't happen without 3 or 4 kind of sort of innocent. Sometimes they're not completely innocent only because they have knowledge, but that becomes the best target for investigators. You did it for a long time, and the reason why is because the criminal knows that he's in a business that sooner or later he's going to get caught, and to some extent he factored in the risk of going in meaning getting arrested. The non-criminal, which is the scapegoat, as you said, never thought in his mind, so he's not going to risk being sentenced. He's not going to risk going to jail, so he's the easy target. So if I was an investigator working for law enforcement, I would pick the least culpable in a scheme, and that's the guy I'm going for, because that's the guy who's going to cooperate.
And it's always the weakest link in the chain.
Correct, because he's involved in the crime through knowledge. There's a charge in the feds called misprison. It's really, you're involved because it's usually tagged on the wives.
Sure.
A co-conspirator has a wife, and the wife is not involved, but she is involved because she gets some money. So that link is always, they have the most to risk. They didn't really commit to committing crimes, but they did. So they're the ones that the investigator is going to go for. In the healthcare, and I'm sorry to continue, in healthcare, that link, if there's a healthcare provider, a clinic, a home health, that link is usually your receptionist. Your receptionist is making a very low hourly rate salary. If it's a kickback scheme, she's receiving the envelope. She has no idea what's in the envelope, but she knows she's receiving an envelope. So those are common targets.
So your recommendation is do not work for any of these little clinics. Most of them are involved in Medicare fraud, unfortunately. But why is it we don't see more doctors going down? Why is it usually the poor, receptionist? Why is it like the owner of the clinic and the doctors you very rarely see getting arrested for this, that are signing off on these bills?
Jeff, doctors get arrested. They get arrested in the state and the feds. They don't get arrested as much. What happens with doctors sometimes, when in the stateside, it's in Spanish they call it mafuku. If you're from Hialeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. That's a state Medicaid unit, and then in the feds, what happens is that the doctor, when these entities start doing the investigation, you always got to go to the doctor, because you got to ask the doctor, did you see patient A, patient B, and patient C? Did you provide the service, or do you know if the clinic paid for that patient to come to you? So the doctor is usually the first stop for the investigator. So to be able to get the doctor to talk, you have to negotiate with them. So sometimes it is true. The doctor is approached first. He's the first one to make it to the microphone, and he's able to negotiate a deal where he cooperates and he stays out. But by no means does that mean the doctors do not get arrested. They get arrested and they get indicted, but they have a little more leverage when it comes to cooperating.
Okay. Now, I want to talk about the controlled call. We've had several officers go down, with that for even sexual, charges against individuals that they were claiming rape. They have the girl call the client, I'm not going to say the client, the defendant, and they say, come on, baby, we did sex once, I just want to come talk to you. And they get tied into this call when it's actually being recorded, and they go down from this call. What advice do you have for our listeners out there that they could even get caught up in conspiracy charges? We worked a lot of cases in the street narcotics unit. I worked for defense teams where the individual's charged with conspiring with drugs. Controlled calls go out, and now they get him from conspiracy when it's just like, hey, Frank, yeah, we're bringing some drugs over to Danny's house, and you don't even realize that you're getting tied into this, but they're trying to get a network down, and as a plea deal, I'm trying to say I can get Frank to go along with this. What advice do you have out there, and how could you avoid this kind of stuff?
Many years ago, I remember a professor in law school, he said, you should always think that you're being recorded. Everything. You should always think, you could be talking to your wife, to your best friend. You should always think that you're being recorded. And you should always think as the listener of that recorder. So the examples that you described now, they got involved, they had knowledge, because if I tell you, hey, Jeffrey, I'm going down to Mike's house, I'm going to take some stuff or whatever, you have knowledge. In conspiracy, you need two things. You need knowledge and you need an overt act. You got to do something. But the truth is that many people get indicted by the feds and they don't really have an overt act. It's a premature arrest.
Correct.
So I guess my overall advice is, you got to think that every single conversation you have with anybody, you're being recorded. Sometimes there's an appearance of impropriety. You need, as a defense attorney, this happens to me and to all criminal defense attorneys. There are conversations that we have on the phone that we would love to think they're attorney-client privilege, but the truth is that there's a fine line there. So if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and don't speak it because somebody's listening. I mean, I hope that answers your question.
No, it certainly does, and that's a great way, a great way to put it. And I'm sure you defend a lot of cases where you've seen the little evidence that they have, probably from the most minute evidence, and they get found guilty, and you're like, I'm confident that this is going to go nowhere, that it's not going to get a conviction. Then I'm sure you handle cases where you have an abundance of evidence against your client, and they get found not guilty. What do you think the mindset is there with these juries, and how does it, what brings to their mind on guilty or not guilty with evidence and no evidence, and they find these people guilty?
Okay. When you go to trial is risky business. I'm a trial attorney, and you're right. You try a case where you're thinking, my God, what am I going to argue? And you win it. And you try a case where there is no way in hell, we're in that kind of interview here, that I can lose it, and you lose it. What happens is that you have to understand the jury is our peers. They're regular people, and they everybody thinks differently. So whenever you that's why negotiations happen. That's why in our system, most cases get negotiated and not tried, because going to trial is risky business. It doesn't matter what you think that your case is or how strong you think your case is. Listen to your attorney, because especially when you're talking about conspiracy. Conspiracy is very difficult to understand to the normal person. Most of these cases, and I'm going to go back to healthcare, they're going to tell you, but how could it be a co-conspirator? There are 11 people in my indictment, and I don't know any of them. How can I conspire with people I don't know? It's a conspiracy. It's the chain link theory. The chain link of a bicycle needs every single link, and one link doesn't know the other. So conspiracy is very difficult. That's the kind of cases that happens, that the person tells you, I didn't conspire, but he did. I did an extradition case where we went in front of a judge in Spain, because when you do extradition cases, you have to prove dual criminality, that the country that they're going to extradite you from has to determine that the crime they're going to extradite you for is a crime in their country. And I think it's called something specificity. My mind fails me now, but they have to find that you could be sentenced for the same thing. So this was a money laundering case where the money launderer could have been exposed to a cocaine charge in the United States, even though he wasn't being charged with cocaine. And we went before a Spanish judge in Spain, and the judge said, man, these Americans are crazy. How can she possibly be attributed for cocaine if she's being charged with money laundering under conspiracy and relevant conduct? What I'm trying to get to is that if you're being charged and you think that there's no case against you, you're thinking too much. Let your attorney do it for you. That's the answer.
And what advice do you usually give your clients? To take a plea if it's a good plea and not take it to trial because the consequences are far greater?
I think it's always a risk analysis. I try to speak to my clients after we do the whole legal mumbo jumbo. I try to speak to them as I would speak to my son. You know, these are the risks. This is where we're at. I'm going to use an example right now, a possible example right now. The sentencing guidelines are 72 months at the bottom of the guidelines. That means that if we go to trial without saying charges or nothing, if we go to trial and the judge finds them guilty, and we have to decide this before next Monday. If the judge finds him guilty, he has to, or he's likely going to sentence him to 72 months. He feels he's not guilty. I think the evidence could find him guilty, maybe. The offer right now is 1 year probation. It's a conviction. It affects the rest of your life. So I think it's a risk analysis. At that point, forget the evidence. Am I willing to risk 72 months if there's a door out, and the door is probation? From a moral standpoint, you may know, I want to risk it. But from a realistic life decision, I think it's a risk analysis. It's not a case analysis, it's a risk analysis.
So do you get gain time just like you would in, if you're with the state and you're serving time with say, the county or the state of Florida? With the feds, do you get gain time just like you would with the state?
Yeah, I don't know if they call it gain time, but I'll tell you what you serve. The general rule in state and feds is pretty much the same. It's 15% off. Just to give an example, I don't know. If you're sentenced to a year, you're going to do 15% less than a year, which that's a month and a half, right? Less.
Correct.
That's the general rule on both of them. And I've been in the system a long time, like you have. Many years ago, you would get sentenced to an amount of time, and the Bureau of Prison would sentence you to that. And if you behaved good, they would remove the time from your sentencing. You know, you were sentenced to a year, and every month they would do a report. And if you behaved well, they will remove it, and they will call that gain time. Then years ago, I want to say 20 maybe, but I may be wrong. I know there are colleagues of me looking at me. They may say, hey, you're wrong. So many years ago, they changed it. You get the gain time from the beginning. From day one, your release date is 15% less. If you behave bad, we take it away. So they switched it. But the general rule is you do 85% of your sentence.
So we had actually a police chief once, and he was like one of my actually favorite police chiefs, and he was arrested for stealing money from Pell. And he's a great guy. He's still around, and it is what it is. It happened, but if they would have gave him a year, apparently he wouldn't have been able to get gain time. But they gave him a year and a day, and that made him eligible for gain time. Is that something that changed, or is that accurate?
That's more gain time. What happens is a year and a day becomes a state prison sentence. It's good and bad. It's bad because now, I've never been able to figure out why it's worse, but I guess the criminal element, you've probably heard it in the movies. I don't want to get a number. I don't want to get a number means that I do not want to go to prison because you get a prison number. From a real standpoint, I'm not sure how it affects you. But I'm not sure the answer. I don't think that in this prison you get more gain time than in the county. I think what happened is that in the prison, you get gain time plus you get halfway house, which technically you're still in prison, but you get a little earlier. So I guess if you're going to do a year and a day, you're going to do less time inside than in the county because you're going to do minus 15% and you're going to go out on a halfway house prior to that. So I think that's what you're talking about.
So, Frank, you're not an attorney now. You know little specifics of this case involving Sergeant Menocal. You have a crystal ball. Now you're a gypsy. What do you foresee happening? Do you foresee him probably taking a plea on this and not risking life in prison or a maximum sentence?
I do, and I do. If I knew nothing about his case, my answer would be the same. I do, because the statistics speak for themselves. I don't want to misphrase the statistics, but I want to say it's more than 95% of all criminal cases that are indicted in the Southern District of Florida and our district plea. So just by that, my answer is yes. Secondly, because he is a police officer, because he's never been exposed to this kind of situation, because he is exposed to a long time in prison for many reasons, not only because of the charges, because he is a police officer, because there is media involved, because everything indicates that if he were to be found guilty in a trial, the sentence is going to be harsh. So my answer is, regardless of what happens in the meantime, they're going to fight it. I'm sure they got very good attorneys. They're going to litigate it. At the end, my guess is they're going to have to negotiate a plea. Because if they do the risk analysis that I told you about, it's way too much.
Well, Francisco Marty, thank you, and we certainly hope that anyone out there listening, if you're in a pickle, you get arrested, or the feds come knocking at your door, that you call Francisco Marty. You would be in good hands because he is, from what I've seen, one of the most top professional defense attorneys in the state of Florida. And there are many, and it's hard to say, to acknowledge when somebody's at the top of their game, but Frank is at top of his game. Thank you, Frank, for being on our show.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I just have a question. Does the scarf come together with the hat? Or can I get the scarf without buying the hat?
Well, we were going to be coming out with the Gotham Investigations scarf line, now that you mentioned that. And part of that, for being on the show, you're going to have to give me a commitment right here that you're going to wear one at one of your trials.
Okay, I want it to be a dark color.
It will be a dark one. Thank you, sir. And tune in for our next episode. This is Jeff Giordano at Gotham Investigations. Thank you. Are you a fan of our show? Do you like our show? Then comment, hit the like button, and subscribe, or you might be the next one we investigate.